The desert range was quiet before she arrived. It was always quiet at 0600. That particular stillness that comes not from absence of sound, but from the complete submission of every living thing to the heat already gathering along the valley floor. The Joshua trees stood motionless. The air tasted of chalk and iron. In the observation tower, Brigadier General Harold Stemmons stood with his coffee, watching his adjutant arrange clipboards along the scoring table below, and he felt the comfortable satisfaction of a man who has never seriously been proven wrong. Today was evaluation day for the Army Marksmanship Qualification Program, the annual showcase where elite long-range shooters competed for certification at ranges most infantry units never trained to engage. Stemmons had overseen 11 of these evaluations. He had watched careers made and unmade on this particular strip of hardpan. He understood, in a way that felt almost philosophical, the relationship between precision and technology. You gave a soldier the right ballistic computer, the right wind tablet, the right digital scope with laser range-finding capability, and you turned an ordinary human being into something approaching a precision instrument. Which was why, when Staff Sergeant Nora Calloway walked onto the range at 0612 carrying nothing but an old Remington 700 with white athletic tape wrapped around the stock, no wind meter clipped to her vest, no laptop case over her shoulder, no rangefinder lanyard around her neck, General Stemmons set down his coffee. He watched her check in at the table. He watched his adjutant, Captain Drew Whitfield, look up from his clipboard with visible confusion. He watched Calloway remove her shooting jacket from a plain canvas bag, shake it once to straighten the collar, and pull it on without ceremony. She was 26 years old, with brown hair pulled back under a ball cap that said nothing, no unit patch, no clever slogan, just faded, olive, drab cotton, worn smooth at the brim. Her rifle was older than most of the cadets standing along the far fence. Stemmons came down from the tower. He crossed the range in his deliberate way, the way that made junior officers straighten involuntarily, and he stopped 3 feet from Calloway with his hands clasped behind his back. "Sergeant Calloway." "General, where is your equipment?" "This is my equipment, sir." Stemmons looked at the rifle the way a man looks at something he genuinely cannot categorize. Then he looked at the row of other competitors behind her, each one standing beside a hard-shell case or a folding table bristling with electronics. The contrast was so stark it was almost artistic. "The primary qualification target today is at 3,000 meters, Stemmons said, slowly, as though she might not have received the briefing materials. "You intend to engage that target with no ballistic computer, no digital wind sensor, no scope that I can see offering anything beyond optical magnification. You are proposing to hit a 3,000-meter steel plate on the first round using what? Instinct?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the sling on her rifle with 2 fingers. "Observation," she said. "Give me 60 seconds at the firing position before I shoot. That's all I'm asking for." Along the fence, 3 cadets exchanged glances. One of them smiled. Stemmons heard it, felt it. Really, the low current of skepticism passing through the observation group like a change in barometric pressure. He considered refusing. There were protocols. There were standards. There was, frankly, a part of him that found this display borderline disrespectful to the serious science of long-range marksmanship that he had spent 3 decades studying and championing. But he was also, underneath everything, a man who had been trained never to walk away from a demonstration. "Fine," he said. 60 seconds. Nora Calloway had grown up in Elk Hollow, Wyoming, on a cattle and alfalfa operation that her grandfather had built from leased grazing land and stubbornness, and which her father, Raymond Calloway, had spent 40 years refining into something that could survive both drought and bank interest. The nearest town with a stoplight was 40 minutes away. The nearest town with a movie theater was closer to 90. This did not bother Nora as a child, because the farm was enormous in the way that only flat land with distant mountains can be enormous, and because her father was the kind of man who made the space feel populated with things worth paying attention to. Raymond Calloway had served 2 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment before a shattered femur ended his operational career in 1994. He came home to Elk Hollow, married a schoolteacher named Patricia Oakes, and began the quiet work of translating everything the Army had taught him about observation and patience into the language of agriculture. He read the sky the way other men read spreadsheets, He knew which cloud formation meant the alfalfa fields needed covering, which shift in barometric pressure meant the cattle would crowd the fence line. He understood wind not as weather, but as a system of information, and he spent a considerable portion of Nora's childhood teaching her to read it. "Watch the grass," he told her when she was 6, kneeling beside her on the edge of the south field. "Don't watch the tops. Watch where it bends. The tops will lie to you. The bend tells you where the force is actually coming from." By the time she was 10, she could tell him the approximate wind speed across the lower 40 acres without looking at the weather vane. Not because she possessed any particular gift, but because she had spent 4 years looking at grass and being corrected when she was wrong, and the corrections had accumulated into something that felt, from the inside, like instinct but was actually calibrated attention. Raymond introduced her to the rifle when she was 12. Not dramatically, there was no ceremony, no moment of presentation. He simply set up a steel gong at 200 yards one Saturday morning and said, as though offering her a new chore, that she ought to learn how this worked. The rifle he gave her was the same Remington 700 that now had white tape around the stock, its walnut worn to a pale gray in the grip area, its scope a fixed power Weaver from roughly the same era as the rifle itself. They had no money for a ballistic computer. They had no money for a wind meter. They had the rifle, a reloading press in the equipment barn, and Raymond's methodical mind. "Here is what a machine does," Raymond said once, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad between them. "It takes measurements and applies a formula. That's it. That's the whole thing. A sensor collects numbers. The formula processes them. If the numbers are right and the formula is right, the answer is right. If either one is wrong, you miss and you don't know why." He tapped the pad. "The farm taught you to collect numbers. Your eyes and your skin collect them. Your brain runs the formula. You're slower than the machine, but you understand what you're measuring, which the machine does not." She had never found a reason to disagree with this analysis. She joined the Army at 21. After 2 years studying agricultural science at the University of Wyoming, that she found intellectually adequate but personally airless. The military aptitude tests identified her for small arms, which surprised no one who had spent time around her on a range. She progressed through marksman qualifications with a steadiness that her instructors found slightly unnerving, because she asked almost no questions and made almost no unnecessary adjustments and, when she missed, always knew exactly why before anyone told her. She had been waiting, in a way she would not have articulated, for someone to ask her to prove the method. Part 3. 3,000 meters. The target was a steel plate, 1 meter square, painted international orange before the evaluation season began, though most of the paint had long since surrendered to the sun and now showed as a pale, rust-colored square, visible through a good spotting scope as a ghost of geometry against the desert floor. 3,000 meters, 1.86 miles. At that distance, the bullet would be in the air for approximately 4 seconds after leaving the muzzle, during which time it would be subject to everything the atmosphere chose to do to it. The morning's evaluation had already produced 6 attempts by qualified shooters using the latest equipment the Army's marksmanship program had provisioned. Sergeant First Class Ben Pruitt had come closest, his first round impacting 11 inches left and low, his adjustment round catching the left edge of the plate for a partial score. The others had scattered their rounds across a roughly 40-inch radius of the target, which was, by any reasonable technical standard, extremely accurate long-range shooting, and by the standard of a first-round hit at this particular distance, a failure. Stemmons had watched the morning's attempts with the satisfaction of a man whose understanding of the difficulty was being confirmed. First-round impact at 3,000 meters was, in his informed assessment, more a matter of favorable conditions than repeatable skill. The variables were simply too numerous: atmospheric density, temperature gradient, Coriolis effect, powder consistency, barrel harmonics, and above all the wind, which at these distances could shift between the shooter's position and the target without any surface indicator the shooter could detect. "Nobody hits first round at 3,000, Stemmons had said to Whitfield that morning, and Whitfield had agreed with the studied agreement of a man who understood that the general was stating a fact, not inviting discussion. And now, Sergeant Nora Calloway was walking to the firing position with an old rifle and 60 seconds of permission, and the cadets along the fence were no longer trying to hide their amusement, and Stemmons was standing with his hands still clasped behind his back, because unclenching them would have communicated something he was not ready to communicate. Sergeant First Class Daniel Vreeland, acting as range safety officer, called the range hot. Calloway lay down behind the rifle without haste. She did not look through the scope. She looked at the valley. The clock started. 60 seconds is not a long time, except when every person watching has agreed to treat it as the longest unit of time available to them. Calloway lay behind the rifle and did not shoot. Her left hand rested flat on the sandbag without gripping anything. Her right hand held the stock lightly at the wrist, the way you hold something fragile that you also need to control. Her cheek was not yet on the stock. She was looking out across the desert with the unfocused attention of someone listening rather than searching, her eyes moving in a slow pattern mirage on the ground glass near the 800-meter mark, the drift of a dust devil forming and dissolving at 1200, the way the heat shimmer tilted fractionally left near the ravine at 2000. 45 seconds remaining. She raised her head slightly and watched the alkali flat to the south, where the wind crossed perpendicular to her line of fire. The vegetation there, brittle scrub, barely knee-high, was bending at a consistent angle. She registered the angle without naming it. She had names for these things in her own internal vocabulary, not the official terminology, but the farm language her father had given her. This was a steady lean, not a flutter, which meant the surface wind was consistent but might not represent the full column. 30 seconds. She settled her cheek on the stock. Then she raised her head again. Something had changed. She couldn't have described what her brain had processed a visual input faster than her language could retrieve it. She looked at the mirage band again, the 400-meter-wide zone of heat distortion that served as the closest thing to a direct wind indicator available between her position and the target. The band had shifted. The lean had become slightly steeper in the last 15 seconds, which meant the wind had increased fractionally or changed angle in the mid-range column. 20 seconds. She adjusted the elevation dial on the scope by a single click. Then she moved the windage 3 clicks left. These were not calculations in the way that engineers use the word. They were the output of a process that had been running continuously in her peripheral awareness since she lay down, the same process that had guided her father's hand when he decided, without checking any instrument, to move the cattle before a storm that hadn't formed yet. 10 seconds. She settled into the stock for the second time and did not come up again. Her breathing slowed to 4 breaths per minute without her deciding to slow it. 5 seconds. She fired on the 3rd second. The Remington's report crossed the valley in a flat, hard wave that the cadets felt in their chests before they heard it with their ears. It was not a spectacular sound. Military-grade cartridges at this caliber made a sharp crack rather than a boom, a sound less like an explosion than like something very large being broken clean. The echo returned off the ridgeline to the north 3 seconds later, a softer version of the original. Then there were 4 seconds of silence, 4 seconds during which no one moved. The cadets along the fence had stopped their quiet commentary. Stemmons stood with his jaw set, watching the spotting scope position where Corporal Andrea Fisk, the spotter assigned to the target, had her eye pressed to the eyepiece. Whitfield was looking at his watch, which was unnecessary, and appeared to know it was unnecessary, and continued anyway. The impact sound arrived at just over 4 seconds. It was a thin, clear ping that traveled back across 3,000 meters of desert air, with the faint mechanical cheerfulness of a steel target being struck by something that meant it, and Corporal Fisk pulled her head back from the scope and said, very clearly, in a voice calibrated for range communication, "Impact, center plate, first round." Nobody laughed. One of the cadets, the one who had smiled, turned to look at the cadet beside him with an expression that was not quite anything yet, still assembling itself from the raw material of what he had just witnessed into something his face could represent. Calloway worked the bolt, extracted the brass, and laid the empty casing carefully on the sandbag beside the rifle. She did not look up. She did not look toward the general. She watched the mirage band, which had settled back to its original angle, as if the whole thing had been a conversation, and the wind had said what it needed to say. Stemmons moved first, because that was his range and no one else was going to determine what happened next on it. He walked to Whitfield, who handed him the scoring tablet without being asked, and Stemmons looked at the telemetry. The system had confirmed the impact, 0.9 meters from center, which within the plate geometry translated to dead center as a practical matter. The time from the start of the 60-second window to the shot was 57 seconds. The round had been in the air 4.1 seconds, slightly longer than the standard engagement model projected for a headwind component of the current magnitude, which meant she had accounted for a headwind component that the system's own sensors had measured at 1.8 miles per hour, a component the system's ballistic algorithm had partially compensated for, a component that the morning's other shooters, with their digital equipment, had undercompensated for by an average of 6 minutes of angle. Stemmons handed the tablet back. He walked to the firing position, where Calloway had risen to her knees and was running a dry patch through the bore with the unhurried attention of someone cleaning something they valued. "Sergeant." "Sir, how did you calculate that shot?" It was not phrased as a question, quite. It was the tone of a man who expected an answer but wasn't entirely sure he was going to understand it. Calloway ran the patch twice more before she answered. "Crosswind off the alkali flat, 4.7 miles per hour from the left, but pulling slightly. It was building, not settled. Temperature gradient increasing from my position to the target. I put it at 2 Celsius over the distance based on the mirage distortion differential. Humidity was dropping. I could feel it in the air against my left cheek. The headwind component I estimated at 1.8, maybe 2, from the way the heat shimmer was tilted rather than layered at the 800-meter band." She paused. "I adjusted for the building crosswind because I knew it was going to be stronger when the bullet crossed that section than it was when I was reading it. That's the variable the digital system gets wrong most often at this range. It reads conditions at the moment of measurement. The bullet has to travel through the conditions as they will be, not as they are." Stemmons was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the range at the distant ghost of the orange plate. "How long have you been doing this without computer assistance?" "Since I was 12, sir." Stemmons was the kind of man who understood that one data point was not a conclusion. He had not reached his rank by accepting the first remarkable thing he saw without testing it. He had reached his rank by insisting on replication, on confirmation, on the kind of evidence that held up when someone more skeptical than himself looked at it from an uncomfortable angle. "Same distance," he told Whitfield, and Whitfield radioed the target crew. "Replace with the qualification target for advanced certification." This was a plate measuring 60 centimeters square, roughly half the area of the primary target. A plate that, during the morning's evaluation, no one had attempted, because the advanced certification was optional, and the consensus assessment among the competing shooters was that attempting it at 3,000 meters was a question of pride rather than strategy. 45 seconds this time, Stemmons said to Calloway. "Same conditions apply. First round impact only." Calloway nodded. She returned to the firing position without hurry. The wind had changed while they were talking. Not dramatically, the valley's thermal pattern was shifting as the morning progressed, and the differential between the valley floor and the ridgeline decreased. A standard progression that Stemmons knew intellectually, but had never spent enough time on this particular range to feel in his body. The alkali flat scrub that had been bending left was now more nearly upright, with an occasional forward lean that suggested the crosswind was becoming variable. Variable crosswind at 3,000 meters was, in Stemmons's experience, the condition that produced the most spectacular misses even from technically proficient shooters. The digital systems were moderately capable at handling it. They could sample wind at high frequency and average the readings, which was better than a static measurement, but still a backward-looking estimate applied to a forward-traveling problem. The cadets had moved closer to the fence, compressing their group toward the end nearest the firing position. The casual amusement of earlier had entirely dissipated. They were watching the way young people watch something they know they will be explaining to someone later. Calloway observed the range for 32 seconds. She made a single dial adjustment windage only, 2 clicks left and fired. The echo came back. Then Corporal Fisk's voice. "Impact. First round. 60 centimeter plate." One of the cadets said something very quietly to no one in particular. Stemmons heard the word but didn't look toward him. He was looking at the mirage band over the desert, trying to see what Calloway had seen, trying to teach himself what he should have learned 40 years ago, and hadn't, because the instruments had always been there to do it for him. It was Whitfield who, during the break period following the evaluation, found the personnel file. He had been looking because Stemmons had asked him to compile background on all the day's competitors, a routine request he now regretted not having fulfilled before the morning's events rather than after them. He brought the file to the general in the briefing trailer with the particular expression of a man delivering information that reorganizes a conversation already concluded. Raymond Calloway, Nora's father, had not been simply a ranger with a farm and a fondness for wind reading. He had competed in the International Practical Shooting Confederation Long-Range Division for 11 years following his medical separation from service, placing in the top 3 at national qualifications in 1998, 2001, 2003, and 2005. He had been quietly legendary in a circuit that operated outside the military's awareness, known among the small population of serious long-range competitors as the man who consistently declined to use anything more than a fixed-power scope and a written dope card, and who, when asked about this, said only that the instruments made you forget you were the instrument. Raymond had stopped competing in 2007, when the femur that had been shattered in service began to fail the joint above it in the way that medical interventions from that era sometimes produced, not catastrophically, but with the grinding persistence of a problem that could be managed but not resolved. He had returned to the farm and, apparently, transferred the entirety of his remaining competitive energy into his daughter's education. Stemmons read the file twice. Then, he sat with it for a while in the way that men sit with information that adjusts their understanding of something they thought they had already assessed correctly. What Calloway had done today was not, he now understood, a surprising display of natural talent operating outside established training structures. It was the most rigorous training he had ever personally witnessed, 14 years of deliberate, painstaking practice conducted without institutional support, without modern equipment, without the validating structure of official certification. It had simply been invisible to him, because it had happened on a farm in Wyoming, under the supervision of a man he had never heard of. He thought about his own shooters. He thought about the hours they spent learning to operate the ballistic computer, calibrating the wind sensors, maintaining the digital scope systems. He thought about what happened to their performance when the equipment malfunctioned, and the answer, he knew it, had always known it, was that it degraded significantly and quickly because the equipment had become not a tool augmenting a skill, but a replacement for a skill that had been permitted to atrophy. Calloway, by contrast, would shoot identically regardless of whether the electronics were functioning. Her capability was not equipment dependent because the equipment had never been available to become a dependency. He set the file on the table and looked out the trailer window at the range, where Calloway was breaking down her position, the Remington disassembled in precise components, laid out on a cloth on the sandbag, each piece being cleaned in sequence with the focused attention of a person who takes care of things. Stemmons called the cadets and the remaining evaluators together at 1,400 in the briefing area behind the tower. 14 people. He stood at the front without notes. "This morning," he said, "I made an assumption that I want to address directly, because I believe it represents a failure of professional judgment that each of you will be at risk of making if I don't name it clearly." No one moved. The cadets, who had spent the first hour of the morning smirking at the farm sergeant with the old rifle, were now watching the general with the particular attention that comes from knowing you are watching something you will remember. I assumed that the absence of equipment indicated the absence of preparation. I assumed that preparation meant equipment. These are not the same thing, and I have spent 40 years in this program knowing they are not the same thing, and I applied the assumption anyway because the equipment has become so normalized in this environment that I had stopped distinguishing between the tools we use to express a skill and the skill itself. He paused. He was not a man given to pauses, which made this one more consequential than it would have been for someone else. "We train soldiers," he continued. Sergeant Calloway trained herself. The distinction I'm pointing to is not that her method is superior to ours, or that we should abandon our technology. The equipment matters, and using it well matters. The distinction is that she understands what the technology is doing, because she learned to do it without the technology first. She reads the wind, and then she uses a scope. We use a scope, and then we hope the wind cooperates. He looked at Calloway, who was standing at the end of the second row in the same position everyone else was standing in, which was to say at attention but with the contained quality of someone not doing it for approval. I'm requesting that Sergeant Calloway consider developing an observation and environmental reading module for the program, not to replace our current methodology. To precede it, he addressed her directly. Sergeant, I'd like to discuss this with you at your convenience. Calloway said nothing for a moment. I'll need to think about it, sir. Of course. He dismissed the group. He did not explain the hesitation to anyone. He understood it, though the instinct of someone who has kept a thing private and valuable for a long time and is being asked to make it institutional, to translate the particular language of her father's teaching into something that could be replicated by strangers and assessed by metrics and credited in databases. He understood the risk she heard in the request. He had learned enough this morning to wait for her answer rather than press for it. 3 weeks later, Nora Calloway drove back to Elk Hollow. She had been granted a 4-day pass, which she had spent 48 hours deciding whether to request before deciding that the decision about the general's offer was the kind she needed to make from the right geography. You could think about Wyoming in a desert range trailer, but you couldn't quite feel it correctly. The context mattered. Her father had always said that context mattered, and anyone who told you they could evaluate conditions from a position they weren't standing in was telling you something about their confidence that they probably should have kept to themselves. Raymond was in the south field when she arrived, repairing a section of fence that the spring thaw had heaved. He heard the truck and finished the post he was setting before he walked back to meet her, because he had been finishing posts since before she was born and a truck could wait. They walked the field together for an hour before she told him about the evaluation. He listened the way he always listened, with the whole body, facing slightly away from her, watching the field, the way she had seen him listen to weather forecasts and veterinary reports and bank loan officers, with the same quality of attention that didn't rank the information by its source but processed it as raw data first. "What are you actually being asked to give up?" he said, when she finished. "I don't know. That's the problem. You're worried they'll take what you know and flatten it. I'm worried they'll turn it into a checklist." Raymond was quiet. The alfalfa in the south field was about 6 inches high, the early growth dense and pale green, bending now in a consistent left-to-right pattern that Nora read automatically as a 4-mile-per-hour wind from the north-northwest, steady with no significant gusting, a clean spring day, the kind you could trust. "You can't teach this in a way that protects it from being simplified," Raymond said finally. "If they take it and make it worse, they'll find out it doesn't work. If they take it and make it better, that's not a loss. The thing you're protecting isn't a secret, it's a method. Methods can be shared." She didn't answer right away. She watched the field. 2 weeks after that, Nora Calloway stood in front of 14 Army marksmen in a room without a projector or a slide deck or any electronic equipment, and began with the thing her father had begun with, the thing that had started all of it on a Wyoming afternoon when she was 6 years old and the world was the size of one field. "Don't watch the tops of the grass," she said. "Don't watch anything that's reacting to the wind. Watch what the wind is doing to the thing beneath it. The reaction tells you what already happened. What's beneath tells you what's happening now." She paused. She had the white-taped Remington leaning against the wall behind her, not because she planned to use it, but because it belonged in the room. It was evidence of what she was describing, the accumulated history of the method made visible in worn walnut and white tape and brass-brightened chamber steel. "Your equipment measures the present moment," she continued. "The bullet travels through the next 4 seconds. To hit the target, you have to know what the next 4 seconds are going to be. The machine cannot do that. It reads what is. You are the only thing in this room capable of reading what is becoming." In the back row, one of the cadets who had stood along the fence 3 weeks earlier, the one who had smiled, the one whose face had not known what to do with itself, after the shot had his field notebook open and was writing with the particular concentration of someone transcribing something